April 1945. Somewhere west of the Rhine, the sky hangs low and colorless, like a lid pressed down on a continent that has been boiling for 6 years. In the distance, ruined towns still smolder, coal smoke, wet plaster, and the bitter scent of burned wood drifting across fields where spring grass tries to return. Inside a temporary American enclosure, barbed wire strung in hard straight lines, floodlights humming, guard towers watching with quiet mechanical patience. German women stand in clusters, shoulders drawn up against cold and uncertainty. Their wool uniforms carry the damp of long marches and overcrowded railcars. Their boots are coated in mud that no longer leads anywhere. From the far edge of the compound, a different smell arrives, steady, impossible, almost insulting in its normality. Coffee. Not a thin substitute, not roasted barley boiled into bitterness, but real coffee. Dark and strong, poured in quantities large enough that the aroma becomes part of the air itself. For the women behind the wire, it is not simply food. It is evidence. It is proof that the enemy's world still functions. They had been raised on a different image of America. In Nazi speeches, in women's magazines, in youth organizations, the United States was painted as a nation of noise and moral decay. Rich but undisciplined, comfortable but weak, generous only because it did not know sacrifice. Captivity under Americans, they were told, would be humiliation at best and violence at worst. Many of these women believed it because belief had become a survival tool. Belief gave structure to hunger. Belief gave purpose to fear. Belief made the war's suffering mean something. Now they are prisoners. And the first lesson is not a beating. It is procedure. An American officer gives an order that sounds administrative, almost small, yet it lands like a hammer. The women are to burn their Nazi uniforms. Not merely remove insignia. Not just surrender badges. To burn the cloth itself. To feed the uniform to flame until it becomes ash. In the camp yard, a fire has been prepared. An iron barrel or a shallow pit. Kindling ready. A controlled blaze meant to consume fabric quickly. The women look at one another with expressions that hover between disbelief and dread. Some grip their collars as if the cloth is still armor. Others stare at the fire as though it is a courtroom. There is no dialogue, no cinematic shouting, no dramatic speech. Only the practical certainty of men who have issued thousands of orders and will issue thousands more. To an American clerk or provost marshal, the logic is direct. In the occupation program, denazification explicitly demanded the elimination of Nazi symbols, anthems, flags, and insignia. The war aim was not only to defeat Germany's armies, but to break the machinery of Nazism as a political and cultural force. Source: and across occupied Germany, Americans were photographed burning Nazi insignia and flags as part of that early denazification work, turning ideology into smoke in public view. Source: but within the barbed wire, the order does something deeper than remove symbols. It tears away the last uniform certainty of a collapsing world. Because by 1945, a German uniform was not merely clothing. It was identity stitched into fabric. It was membership. It was a story you could wear. For men at the front, it meant rank and belonging. For women in auxiliary services, clerks, radio operators, air raid staff, nurses, it was also a shield against chaos. In the final year of the war, when German cities became rubble and trains became rolling refugee camps, the uniform still opened doors and protected bodies. It could mean a ration. It could mean a place in a queue. It could mean the difference between being treated as useful or being treated as nothing. Now they are ordered to burn it. And there is another shock layered into the moment. The Americans do not starve them first. They feed them first. Coffee returns, not as symbolism invented later, but as a sensory fact that will not go away. In the American POW system, prisoners repeatedly described the strange disorientation of being fed and housed by an enemy whose land had not been bombed into dust. The U.S. held roughly 425,000 German POWs in about 700 camps, an operation so vast it became a logistical industry. Source: the camps resembled military installations, barbed wire, watchtowers, routine. And the routine included rations. Included schedules. Included the strange steadiness of a nation that could still afford to boil coffee by the kettle and bread by the crate. Source: Coffee becomes the recurring object in this story, the symbol that keeps returning like a refrain. Not because it is beautiful, but because it is undeniable. It becomes a smell that argues with propaganda without speaking. The women had expected American cruelty to arrive as fists. Instead, it arrives as a system, paperwork, lists, and rules that do not require hatred to function. In some ways, that is more frightening. Hatred is personal. It can be negotiated with fear. A system is impersonal. It cannot be pleaded with. The women are escorted, in groups, toward the fire. They remove coats, skirts, caps, sometimes armbands. Some garments are thrown reluctantly, as if the hand itself resists. Others are dropped with rigid obedience, the final reflex of a state that trains citizens to obey even in collapse. Cloth catches fire fast. Wool shrinks, then blackens. Thread curls like hair. The sharp smell of burning fabric rises into the air, mixing with the smell of coffee. In that blend is an accidental symbolism, the dying smoke of dictatorship and the steady aroma of a country that still produces food. This moment matters because it captures the collision of two historical processes at once, the collapse of the Nazi state and the Allied attempt to dismantle its ideology. Denazification was not only trials and arrests. It was also the deliberate removal of symbols from public space, signs, flags, insignia, because totalitarian regimes do not merely govern through laws, they govern through imagery. The Allied program framed denazification as a war aim and included the elimination of Nazi symbols as a fundamental element. Source. And in prisoner compounds, whether in Europe or later in the United States, the same principle applied. Symbols carried power, and power had to be neutralized. In America, the POW experience became a strange mirror held up to the Reich's propaganda. German prisoners were transported on ships and trains through an undamaged country and often remarked on its vastness and prosperity. Source: many had feared capture by the Soviets and preferred surrender to the British or Americans, knowing from the Eastern Front that Soviet captivity could mean death in enormous numbers. Source: but even surrender to the West carried dread, especially for women, who had been fed nightmares of Allied revenge. What they encountered instead was a form of power that did not need myth to survive. This is where emotional contrast becomes the story's engine. They expected Americans to be barbaric. They expected insults, beatings, deliberate degradation. They expected to be treated as less than human. The reality was more complex: captivity, routine, and a policy-driven insistence that Nazi symbols could not remain. The order to burn uniforms is not humane in the way prisoners might hope. It is humiliating, yes, but more than that, it is disorienting. Because the uniform had been a personal defense against meaninglessness. Burning it is like burning the last remaining map. Some women feel fear not only of the Americans, but of what comes afterward. Because in Nazi culture, abandoning symbols could be interpreted as betrayal. Even in camps far from Germany, committed Nazis had policed one another. In the American POW system, the U.S. often relied on German officers and NCOs to maintain internal discipline, efficient, but it sometimes allowed hardcore Nazis to intimidate or punish others. Source: that threat, fear of one's own side, was a shadow that followed many prisoners into captivity. For women, the fear could be more personal still. In Germany's collapse, accusations flew in both directions: fanatic, traitor, coward, collaborator, whore, defeatist. A uniform could be both protection and accusation. Burning it removed protection, but also removed the accusation's evidence. It was liberation and stripping at the same time. The Americans, for their part, were navigating their own contradictions. They had suffered losses. They had seen Europe's ruins. Some had liberated camps and carried those images inside their minds like poison. Yet the U.S. prisoner system, especially in the U.S. itself, had been built under the Geneva Convention framework, requiring comparable quarters and rations to those of American soldiers. Source: for much of the war, that meant prisoners could be fed relatively well, sometimes better than civilians back in Germany. The contrast produced resentment among some Americans at home, who wrote letters protesting good treatment of enemy soldiers. But the system remained: rules, inspections, schedules. The coffee pot kept boiling. And then, as the war ended and the camps were liberated, Another weapon entered the prisoner compounds: film. After the liberation of Nazi concentration camps, POWs were shown footage of atrocities, often under armed supervision. The images produced shock, anger, disbelief. Some prisoners nicknamed them films of bones. Source at Camp Butner in North Carolina. After viewing such footage, 1,000 German POWs burned their Wehrmacht uniforms voluntarily, an event recorded in North Carolina historical accounts of POW life. Source: this is critical historical evidence, because it shows a psychological mechanism. Burning the uniform could become a moral act rather than a forced humiliation. The uniform, once an emblem of duty, became a symbol of contamination. The fire became a ritual of disconnection, an attempt to say, without words, I will not carry this identity home. Other summaries of the POW experience note that Holocaust films sparked rage and disbelief, and they mention uniform burning as one extreme reaction. Source: in our camp scene with the German women, the burning is ordered. But the larger historical context shows that burning the uniform became, in some places, a human response to unbearable evidence. This is where transformation begins, not as instant conversion, and not as a clean moral awakening, but as fracture. For years, Nazi ideology had insisted that Germany was fighting for civilization, that its enemies were monsters, that the Reich was a fortress against chaos. The uniform turned that ideology into daily ritual. It kept individuals from asking too many questions by giving them a place in the story. But once the story collapses, once Germany is defeated, once the camps are liberated, once atrocity footage is shown, then the uniform becomes a problem. It becomes proof that you belong to something you may not want to admit, even to yourself. The women watch their uniforms burn, and in that fire they are forced to confront a terrifying idea, that their identity may have been borrowed from a regime that lied. Some of them had been genuine believers. Others had been opportunists. Many had been apolitical, in the way people become apolitical under dictatorships, meaning they survive by not looking too hard. In a totalitarian state, the line between belief and survival blurs until it becomes invisible. Now that line returns, sharp as a knife. The American camp does not offer them comfort, but it offers them something else, a working alternative. It offers rules enforced without theatrical ideology. It offers food that arrives because a system delivers it, not because a leader promised it. It offers schedules that do not depend on the myth of a chosen race or a destined empire. It offers the unsettling reality that a democracy can be strong not because it is pure, but because it is organized. This is why coffee matters as recurring symbolism. Coffee is the smallest, most ordinary proof of a large truth. America's abundance is not magic. It is capacity, factories, farms, shipping, logistics, bureaucracies. A democratic state, imperfect and full of contradictions, can still produce and distribute resources at scale. Inside the wire, the women begin to understand that ideology is also a system, one that produces obedience, sacrifice, and myth. The Reich had demanded scarcity as virtue. America's coffee makes scarcity look less like virtue and more like failure. The women are issued replacement clothing, or they are allowed to keep some non-symbolic garments. The details vary from camp to camp, but the principle is consistent in Allied policy. Nazi insignia and symbols must be removed from public display, and denazification must be seen to be happening. Source: the burning becomes not only a practical disposal of symbols, but a spectacle of transition, an announcement that the old identity is no longer permitted. The fire dies down. Ash settles. The women remain. Now comes the deeper part of the story. What changes inside them after the cloth is gone? In many POW camps, prisoners had time, too much time. Time to think. Time to remember. Time to hear rumors, receive letters, watch guards live their ordinary lives. In the United States, the POW system included educational programs and films intended to re-educate Germans and expose them to American geography, history, and politics. Source: even when those programs were officially described as intellectual diversion, their purpose was clear: to erode Nazi belief, or at least to weaken it. But the most powerful re-education was often accidental, the experience of being treated according to rules, and living inside a functioning society rather than a collapsing dictatorship. The women did not have to be persuaded by speeches. The coffee did the persuading. Every morning, the aroma returns. The ration arrives. The guards change shifts. Paperwork continues. No one needs to shout freedom for freedom to reveal itself as something practical, a nation stable enough to enforce restraint. This does not mean the women suddenly admire America. Captivity is captivity. The barbed wire is real. The loss is real. Many of them have families in ruins. Some have lost husbands or brothers. Many do not know whether their homes still stand. And they fear returning to a Germany that will be occupied, divided, and forced to rebuild among moral ruins as well as physical ones. Yet a transformation can still occur in such conditions. Not because captivity is kind, but because the shock of reality breaks propaganda's spell. The uniform had promised belonging. It delivered defeat. The Reich had promised protection. It delivered collapse. The enemy had been described as monstrous. It delivered coffee and procedure. And then the images arrive, the films of bones, and the final defense fails. Source. At that point, burning a uniform is no longer simply the destruction of cloth. It is the destruction of excuses. The women begin to understand a deeper, darker truth, that the Nazi state had used symbols to occupy the mind. A swastika on an armband, an eagle on a cap, a uniform's cut and color. These were not decorations. They were tools of psychological ownership. They trained citizens to see themselves as parts of a destiny rather than as responsible individuals. Denazification sought to break those tools. Source: in the burning of symbols, captured in photographs of American soldiers burning Nazi insignia, was a visible method of that breaking. Source: the camp yard becomes a small stage on which the post-war world begins. The women are no longer defined by rank, insignia, and state narrative. They are defined by their human vulnerability, cold hands, tired eyes, uncertain futures. Without the uniform, the Reich cannot speak through them anymore. And that silence is terrifying because it forces them to ask, what do we believe now? Some will cling to bitterness. Some will retreat into denial. Some will tell themselves they were only servants, only helpers, only nurses. Some will feel disgust at the regime, and equally deep disgust at themselves for having lived inside it. Many will carry contradictions for the rest of their lives. But something does change. Because the uniform's burning is irreversible. A dictatorship can survive defeat in battle if it survives in memory. Symbols keep memory alive. That is why the Allies targeted symbols. Source: burning the uniform is, in a small way, a strike against the possibility that Nazism remains wearable. Coffee returns again in the narrative, because it is the counter symbol, not of purity, but of abundance governed by rules. It is a democratic scent, ordinary, repeatable, produced by systems rather than charisma. It becomes a reminder that freedom can be mundane and still powerful. In the epilogue, the camera of history pulls back. Across Germany, buildings still lie open like broken teeth. Across Europe, displaced persons move along roads like rivers. In occupied cities, posters go up, names are scraped off street signs, flags are removed, symbols are burned. Denazification proceeds unevenly, contested and imperfect, but driven by a stated aim: to remove Nazi and militarist influences, to eliminate symbols, and to prevent propaganda's return. Source: inside a POW camp yard, a small pile of ash cools in the dirt. It is all that remains of a uniform that once promised a 1,000-year Reich. The women step back from the fire, breathing smoke and coffee in the same air. In that mixture is the uncomfortable lesson of 1945. Ideology can demand sacrifice, but it cannot always provide bread. It can command loyalty, but it cannot always keep a nation alive. And when it collapses, it leaves people holding the remnants, buttons, ashes, memories, and a question that cannot be burned away. Freedom is not always heroic music. Sometimes it is a schedule. Sometimes it is a ration issued even to enemies. Sometimes it is a country stable enough to obey its own rules when revenge would be easier. Sometimes it is coffee boiled behind barbed wire. Evidence that a system can endure without needing to hypnotize its citizens with symbols. The uniform turns to ash because it was never eternal. The coffee aroma returns each morning because a different kind of power, industrial, procedural, democratic, keeps working even when the world has been shattered. And in that quiet contrast lies the larger truth. Dictatorships feed themselves on spectacle, But democracies, at their best, feed even those who once wore the spectacle on their skin.